Today we're going to talk about language acquisition. A nurse places a baby in its gas respirator during a drill at a London hospital. Suppose you are that baby. You're stuck in this awful contraption. You're undoubtedly uncomfortable. How would you tell the nurse? Now, you might say this, or this, or even this, or it might be just this. But if you're stuck in little Johnny's body, all that comes out is this. Some sound that's designed to make everyone around you, especially your mother, uncomfortable. You want to be heard, but you don't have a lot of options. The sounds coming out of your mouth don't sound much like the sounds of human language. Just try and transcribe it. There are no IPA symbols for transcribing baby crying. So this defines our first challenge. How does the baby get from here to there? In other words, how do humans acquire language? It's not at all a trivial task. There is a change from seemingly random crying, though it's not completely random either. Baby cries differ depending on whether they are hungry or sleepy or upset. But nevertheless, these differences are not in control of the baby. That's where the change comes in. From automatic crying, which babies can only hope their caregivers will be able to interpret, to being able to communicate with intention and precision. Now, the first thing to note is that we talk about language acquisition. Here we ask how humans acquire language. Why do we say acquire? Why don't we say, how do humans study language? Well, we could ask that question, but if we do, we have in mind the active, conscious process of learning a language. That is, a second or a third or a fourth language. We don't usually think of babies studying language to learn how to communicate with it. Acquiring our first language doesn't involve reading books or being instructed or drilling vocabulary. It is, in fact, fully automatic. The baby really can't help it. It's just like a reflex. You know, when you hit the right spot at your knee, your lower leg will extend. It's the same with language. If the baby gets hit, so to speak, with language, it will eventually grow up speaking that language. It will end up with all of that knowledge that we talked about in this course. Sound, syllable structure, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. And as you know, much of this knowledge is unconscious. That's another way in which studying something differs from acquiring it. If you study something, you hopefully have conscious knowledge of what you have studied, knowledge that can be tested in quizzes and midterms. But acquiring something leads to knowledge that you are not even aware of. All you know is that you can communicate with the language you know and that you can say pretty much everything you want. To appreciate how massive that task of acquiring a language really is, let's review a bit of the things we know when we know a language. So, here's what the nurse says to the baby. But what the baby hears is just a string of sounds. Little Johnny doesn't understand because he hasn't yet studied his vocabulary, so to speak, or rather, he hasn't acquired his words just yet. He's not yet able to associate the sounds with their meanings. Speaking of words, how would little Johnny even identify the words? There aren't always breaks between our words. We do not talk like this. Would you please remove me from this contraption? I am rather uncomfortable. If we do talk like this, then the corresponding waveforms look indeed like this. There are, in fact, pauses in between words, as indicated by the flat lines. But that's not how we actually talk. Compare this to what actually happens in natural speech. Here words are only sometimes divided by breaks or pauses in the strings of sounds. There's only one clear break in this string of sounds, and it corresponds to the sentence boundary. The words themselves are hardly ever identifiable based on the string of sounds. That's why you don't necessarily hear where the word boundaries are, if you're not familiar with the language, that is. To feel a bit like little Johnny must feel, just listen to people speaking in a foreign language, where you don't already know the words. For example, Kast mir jetzt bitte det Wasser da, das ist überhaupt nicht angenehm. How many words did I say? It's 11 words, but you could probably not guess all of the word boundary. That's because in the string of sounds here, there are no clear boundary markers. So that's the first task little Johnny has to face. He will have to identify the words of the language, but in order to do so, he will have to be able to isolate them. Before we can figure out what words mean, we have to first be able to identify them. Now, when we talk to babies, we often talk a little differently. Look at the goose. What a nice goose. Do you like the goose? Yeah, this is a goose. Say goose. Caregivers are known to talk to babies in special ways. It's known as motherese. But of course, these days you should hopefully also find fatherese. This way of talking may facilitate the recognition of words. And of course, nursery rhymes may also facilitate this process. But nursery rhymes and motherese alone won't do the trick. We know this because special baby-directed speech is not found across all cultures. Nevertheless, language is acquired in all cultures. So maybe motherese is helpful in the acquisition process, but it's definitely not necessary. Now, in addition to the word segmentation problem, there are many other problems little Johnny has to face. He has to figure out the sounds of the language surrounding him, and he has to figure out how these sounds are made. He has to learn to use his vocal tracts, shape his mouth, his tongue, and put them in the right position. Just remember how much problems you had with figuring out the IPA and the sounds it represents. Little Johnny growing up will be able to identify all the sounds. In fact, little Johnny will go through a stage where he practices the sounds of the language by means of cooing and babbling, like so. That's the first stage in language acquisition. It happens around 6 to 8 months of age. Just producing sounds, though no meaning yet. But even that is not a trivial task. For example, there must be some way for Johnny to know that a sound like E is the same no matter whether it's loud, E, or quiet, E, high pitch, E, or low pitch, E. Think about it. How do we know that E and E are the same sound, but E and A are not? How does Johnny know what to pay attention to and what he can ignore to figure out the sound inventory of his language? So suppose little Johnny's got that down. He'll still have to figure out how to associate meaning with these sounds. He still has to acquire the words of the language. Without that, his communicative system will not be much better than guesswork. Somehow, he has to assign meaning to the sounds he produces to be able to communicate. So how do we learn words? Well, again, there is probably some child-directed speech that will help the process. Like when the caregiver tells little Johnny, "This is a dog," and "This is fog," and "This is a pretty cool-looking god." So yes, these acts of pointing and mentioning the words in simple structures may help. And in the beginning of his speaking life, Johnny will make use of words alone. He'll start with one-word utterances. Well, that's better than pure guesswork now, since little Johnny will be able to express some meaning. He still won't be able to say everything he wants to say. It gets better when he can produce utterances of more than one word. He goes through the 2-word stage at around 18 to 24 months, through the telegraphic stage at up until about 30 months. But it's only after 30 months or so that function words and grammatical structures emerge, and only then will little Johnny be able to say everything he wants. Now, considering that's really fast. Within the span of less than 3 years, little Johnny is able to get from here to here. That's really quite extraordinary. And after that, of course, the acquisition continues. It is estimated that a preschooler acquires about 10 words a day. Just imagine, you could do that when you learn a new language. 10 words a day. That's 70 words a week and about 300 words a month. So this whole process of language acquisition is not only automatic, it's also incredibly fast. How can it be so fast? Well, little Johnny is probably really motivated to get the job done. Remember how uncomfortable he must have felt in here. Crying didn't get him very far, in comparison to being able to articulate precisely what he wants, so people understand and can react. So there's definitely some advantages in acquiring a language. You get what you want, unless, of course, your demands are unreasonable. So some have argued that that's precisely why we learn language so fast. Correct use of language receives positive reinforcement. Incorrect use results in negative reinforcement. The names associated with this behaviorist view are Pavlov, yes, from Pavlov's dog, Watson, and Skinner. For them, language acquisition was all about stimulus and response, and all they were interested in is studying the stimuli and the responses. Right, the behavior. What is going on in our minds to get us from a stimulus to a response wasn't part of their object of study. In fact, they said that we cannot study this. It's a black box. Now, undoubtedly, conditioning works. If you have a dog, you train the dog by giving him rewards at the right time, and he'll be conditioned for the behavior you want him to display. But this kind of explanation won't get you very far in explaining all the patterns of language that we observe. Remember this one. There's no communicative advantage to know that it's 1.0 cats as opposed to 1.0 cat. Nevertheless, if you learn English, if you acquire English, you acquire this pattern. And negative reinforcement doesn't really have much effect in language acquisition either. Take, for example, this dialogue. Want other one spoon, Daddy? You mean you want the other spoon? Yes, I want other one spoon, please, Daddy. Can you say the other spoon? Other one spoon. Say other. Other. Spoon. Spoon. Other spoon. Other spoon. Now, give me other one spoon. So here the dad isn't paying attention to what the child wants. Instead, he corrects the child and wants him to speak properly. Now, that's not really successful communication on the part of the child. Nevertheless, the child is not changing his behavior. So somehow behaviorist theories won't be able to explain all about the language acquisition process. But how else do we do it? Now, from this example here, we can also rule out another potential hypothesis, namely that it's all about imitation. Suppose we're just like parrots, and we learn by imitation. But that wouldn't explain the observation that kids produce things that they never even heard. Like, for example, in this dialogue. Nobody don't like me. No, say, nobody likes me. Nobody don't like me. And this goes on. No, now listen carefully. Say, nobody likes me. Oh, nobody don't likes me. Despite mother's effort, the child refuses to repeat exactly what mom is telling her. Instead, she has her own grammar. A grammar that's compatible with whatever stage in the acquisition she's at right now. Interestingly, a similar strategy for negation is found in some adult languages as well, like, for example, in French. So arguably the child produces something that is a possible natural language. It just happened to not be standard English. So to answer the question how kids acquire language automatically and so fast and without paying attention to corrections, Noam Chomsky has developed a theory of language that postulates an innate language acquisition device, a universal grammar. This is one way of understanding one of the design features of language we have talked about at the very beginning of this course. Language is used by everyone, everywhere. Humans can't help but acquiring language, and language acquisition does not depend on intelligence. The capacity for language is universal. Instead of thinking that little Johnny has to start from scratch, that his mind is like an empty slate, the assumption is that children create their own grammar on the basis of not only environmental input, hearing the language, but also on their own constrained hypotheses, expectations about what kind of system language can be. And these hypotheses and expectations are what we may refer to as universal grammar. And consequently, linguists working within the Chomskyan tradition are interested in what's going on in our minds. Linguistics is a way of getting a glimpse into that black box. Now, whether there is indeed such a thing as universal grammar is still open for debate. But as someone who works within this framework, I think that it has been immensely fruitful as a research agenda. A research agenda that goes beyond understanding the language process. It has produced really interesting results in the questions as to what about language is universal and what can vary.